It smelled like furniture, not war. The German engineers gathered around the wreckage in a dim hangar outside Hamburg, their white coats already stained with graphite and oil. A Mosquito bomber, captured almost intact after being forced down in a farmer's field, lay disassembled under floodlights. Its pale wooden panels looked absurdly domestic, like something stolen from a carpentry shop rather than the sky. They had been told this was the fastest bomber the British possessed, capable of outrunning Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs at full throttle. That claim seemed impossible to the Luftwaffe's engineers. Wood belonged to the past, to toys, to furniture, to museum relics, not to the era of jets and high-octane fuel. Dr. Karl-Heinz Henkel, a senior materials analyst from the Luftfahrt Ministerium, adjusted his spectacles and tapped one of the panels with a knuckle. The sound was not metallic, but dull and resonant, like knocking on a coffin. "It's plywood," he murmured, disbelief creeping into his voice. Around him, technicians chuckled. "A wooden bomber," one said mockingly. "The English must have run out of aluminum," another added. "And yet it outran everything we threw at it. Maybe it runs on witchcraft." The laughter faded into uneasy silence as they studied the construction more closely. No rivets, no seams. The joins were seamless, the curves flowing like something grown, not built. One of the engineers tried prying at a panel edge with a screwdriver but stopped, grimacing. "It's glued," he said. "But this adhesive, it's not coming apart." Henkel bent closer, running his finger along the surface. It felt smooth, warm, alive. Somewhere in the back of the hangar, a mechanic muttered under his breath, "If this is wood, then it's wood the devil himself designed." The Mosquito, silent and broken, still seemed to mock them. To understand how a wooden plane had terrified the Luftwaffe, one had to go back to the dark winter of 1938 in Britain, a time when the clouds of war were gathering and resources were scarce. While Germany's factories were roaring with steel and fire, Britain faced a painful truth. If war broke out again, they simply couldn't match the German machine for machine. Aluminum was precious, the skies would be filled with metal, and yet one man dared to imagine something utterly different. That man was Geoffrey de Havilland, a visionary aircraft designer with the calm confidence of a craftsman and the stubbornness of a dreamer. When he proposed building a high-speed bomber made almost entirely of wood, the Air Ministry officials thought he'd lost his mind. They wanted guns, armor, and heavy bomb loads, not a stripped-down wooden dart. "You can't fight a war with furniture," one official scoffed. But de Havilland wasn't building a war machine in the conventional sense. He wanted speed, so much. Speed that no enemy fighter could catch it, no flak could track it. His idea was simple yet radical. Eliminate everything that slowed a plane down. No gun turrets, no excess armor. Just a lightweight airframe, two of the most powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, and aerodynamics that sliced through the air like a razor. He called it the Mosquito. At first, no one wanted to fund it. Britain was preparing for war, and priorities leaned toward fighters like the Spitfire or bombers like the Lancaster. Wooden aircraft were seen as relics from another era. But de Havilland pressed on, using his own company's funds and the skills of craftsmen who usually built pianos, furniture, and fine cabinetry. The Mosquito was not forged in steelworks. It was carved in workshops, its skeleton assembled with the precision of a violin. When the first prototype finally took to the skies in late 1940, it stunned everyone who saw it. The Mosquito didn't just fly, it streaked across the horizon at speeds that rivaled, and soon surpassed, the best German fighters. The test pilots returned, grinning, unable to believe the instruments. It was fast. Too fast. The wooden construction gave it more than speed. It gave it stealth. Radar operators often missed it entirely, and its smooth surface reflected less signal than metal. It was light, maneuverable, and could climb faster than almost anything else in the air. And best of all, it could carry a bomb load nearly as large as a 4-engine heavy bomber, yet fly twice as fast. The British military couldn't ignore it any longer. By 1941, production began in earnest. De Havilland's design became a symbol of quiet defiance, a weapon born not from industry's brute strength, but from ingenuity, craftsmanship, and desperation. The Mosquito entered combat, and the results were immediate. It flew reconnaissance missions deep over Germany, returning with photographs of entire cities untouched by flak. It bombed Gestapo headquarters in broad daylight, skimmed over treetops, and raided Berlin itself with surgical precision. The Luftwaffe's commanders were furious. How could something so simple, so primitive, humiliate their advanced machines? In Germany, reports began to circulate about a mysterious British bomber made of wood that couldn't be caught or shot down. The idea sounded absurd until wreckage started to appear in their fields and forests. Each piece told the same story. There was no metal skeleton, no riveted skin, just layers of wood bonded with some kind of resin. Back in the dim hangar near Hamburg, Dr. Hankel and his team didn't yet know the full story. But they were beginning to realize that the Mosquito wasn't just another British aircraft. It was a message, a sign that the enemy had found a new way to fight, one that didn't rely on the same rules. A wooden plane had just rewritten the science of war. The first time the Mosquito roared down the runway at de Havilland's airfield, even the test crew could hardly believe what they were witnessing. The engines screamed, the wooden frame shuddered, and then it was airborne, climbing like a predator released from its chains. Observers on the ground swore it moved like a living thing, smooth and effortless, with none of the clunky heaviness of metal bombers. The Air Ministry officials who had mocked it stood in silence, hats in their hands, as the Mosquito vanished into the clouds. Within months, production lines sprang up across Britain, not in vast steel plants, but in furniture factories and woodworking shops. Carpenters who had once built dining tables now shaped wings. Cabinet makers crafted fuselages. It was the kind of grassroots ingenuity that only wartime necessity could inspire. The wooden panels were layered, balsa sandwiched between sheets of birch and spruce, all bonded by a mysterious synthetic adhesive that de Havilland's chemists guarded fiercely. The result was a body both light and unyielding, a structure that could absorb bullets and still hold together at 400 miles per hour. When the first operational Mosquitoes took off in 1941, they immediately began rewriting the rules of aerial combat. Reconnaissance units reported breathtaking results. They could fly faster and higher than anything in the sky, snapping photos of enemy positions without a single escort. German radar barely noticed them, and even when spotted, interceptors couldn't keep up. The aircraft's smooth wooden surface reflected radar waves in unpredictable ways, giving it a ghost-like signature. To the Luftwaffe, it became known as Der Holzgeist, the wooden ghost. Soon, it wasn't just cameras the Mosquito carried. Its speed made it the perfect precision bomber. British command realized that, with skilled pilots, it could deliver surgical strikes deep into occupied Europe. No massive formations, no citywide devastation, just a handful of Mosquitoes, slipping through the clouds, hitting their targets, and vanishing before the enemy could react. In early 1942, they proved it beyond doubt. A squadron of Mosquitoes raided Gestapo headquarters in Oslo, diving low over the fjords. German anti-aircraft guns thundered, but the Mosquitoes were gone before the smoke cleared. The building was shattered, records destroyed, prisoners freed. The mission lasted less than half an hour. Pilots adored the aircraft. It responded like a fighter, climbed like a hawk, and could carry bombs that seemed impossible for its size. One navigator said flying the Mosquito felt like being in a dream that outran death. Another called it the plane that forgave mistakes. By mid-1943, the Mosquito had become a legend. It performed photo runs over Berlin itself, mocking Göring's defenses. British newspapers celebrated it as a miracle of craftsmanship, a wooden wonder that made fools of the Nazi engineers. But in Germany, that mockery burned deeply. Göring himself raged that his modern Luftwaffe, armed with jets, rockets, and steel, was being humiliated by what he called a piece of English plywood. He demanded to know how it was possible. How could this absurd wooden creation defy the laws of physics and outfly his best? And so, orders were given. The next Mosquito to fall into German hands was not to be destroyed. It was to be captured intact, studied, and dismantled piece by piece. Somewhere, in a factory or laboratory, lay the secret that made this thing unstoppable. And soon, they would find it. The night sky over Berlin burned red as the first wave of Mosquitoes screamed overhead. Searchlights clawed at the clouds, but the bombers moved too fast, too low, too unpredictably. German gunners fired blindly, their tracers stitching the air like fiery threads. The mosquitoes darted between them, ghostly silhouettes of speed and nerve. Inside one cockpit, Squadron Leader John Red Davidson gripped the controls, his oxygen mask fogged, his eyes locked on the glowing skyline ahead. Their target, the heart of the German propaganda machine. Berlin had been hit before, but never like this. The mosquitoes didn't arrive in massive formations. They came in pairs, slipping through radar nets, diving through anti-aircraft fire, and vanishing before the alarms could even fully sound. In just a few minutes, they unleashed their bombs with surgical precision, tearing into radio transmitters and communication hubs. When the Luftwaffe scrambled fighters to intercept, the mosquitoes were already gone, turning for home, engines roaring, wooden bodies vibrating with the speed that kept them alive. Göring was livid. The head of the Luftwaffe, the man who had promised the German people that Berlin was untouchable, now found his words mocked by British carpentry. Those damned wooden planes, he shouted during a furious briefing. They come when they please, do what they please, and leave when they please. It's an insult to the Reich. In the weeks that followed, his fury turned to obsession. He ordered that every effort be made to capture one of these British bombers intact. Patrols were adjusted. Intelligence agents were told to watch for crash sites. And then, one cold morning in late 1943, a report arrived that made Göring sit up in his chair. A mosquito had been forced down in northern Germany. Mechanical failure, perhaps. The crew had escaped, but the aircraft miraculously was mostly intact. Within hours, a recovery team cordoned off the field where it had landed. The plane was transported under heavy guard to a Luftwaffe testing facility near Hamburg. There, under the harsh lights of an aircraft hangar, a group of the Reich's finest engineers and materials scientists gathered around it, their curiosity piqued and their pride wounded. When they began to take it apart, they expected the familiar gleam of aluminum, the reassuring ring of riveted metal. Instead, their tools met something unexpected. Wood that resisted cutting blades, glued joints that refused to separate, surfaces that looked too smooth, too perfect. Every attempt to dismantle the fuselage felt like trying to take apart a living organism. Dr. Karl-Heinz Henkel was among them, summoned from Berlin to examine this strange machine. As he studied the mosquito's structure, he realized they were staring at something entirely new. The layers of wood were fused together with a resin that didn't crack under stress, didn't weaken with heat, and didn't separate when soaked. Whatever this adhesive was, it was far beyond anything the Reich's chemical industry had yet created. As technicians worked late into the night, the hangar filled with the faint scent of varnish and burned resin. Henkel ran his fingers across the smooth interior of the fuselage, shaking his head. It's as if the British have built this with the precision of a violin, he whispered, and the strength of armor. Around him, the others were silent. Somewhere above, air raid sirens began to wail. The British were coming again. The irony wasn't lost on them. As bombs fell in the distance, the Germans realized the truth. This wooden plane, this so-called flying furniture, might hold the secret that had turned the air war against them. And they were determined to uncover it. The hangar smelled of scorched resin and damp earth. Floodlights glared down on the disassembled mosquito as if it were an alien corpse under autopsy. Every panel, every bolt, every fiber of its strange wooden skin was being catalogued by the best engineers the Reich could assemble. For days they had chipped, pried, and sanded. But the more they uncovered, the less sense it made. Dr. Karl-Heinz Henkel, exhausted and pale, stood over a microscope with a sample of the adhesive. He had boiled it, frozen it, dissolved it in acid, nothing broke it down. The resin didn't behave like any known glue. When heated, it hardened further instead of melting. When cooled, it flexed slightly but never cracked. It was, to Henkel's mind, the most infuriatingly perfect bond he had ever seen. This isn't woodwork, he muttered to himself, adjusting the focus on the scope. It's alchemy. A younger engineer, Otto Brandt, approached carrying a wooden strip cut from the fuselage. Herr Doctor, we tried the saw again. The teeth are dull. The wood burns before it cuts. Henkel looked up, unimpressed. Then cool the blade, or find another way. We must see how these layers interact. He took the piece and tapped it gently against the table. It sounded solid, not hollow like normal plywood. This is not just wood. It's a composite. The British have turned furniture into armor. As word spread through the Luftwaffe testing division, rumors swirled like cigarette smoke. Some whispered the British were using enchanted materials. Others said the glue was made from synthetic chemicals stolen from German patents. Henkel knew better. The resin was synthetic, yes, but unlike anything the Reich's chemical industry had ever produced. He suspected phenolic resins, a class of adhesives barely in its infancy before the war. But this version, this was something advanced. He made a note in his logbook. The adhesive exhibits tensile strength comparable to metal under pressure. Impossible with current formulations. Source unknown. Must investigate manufacturing process. When his report reached Berlin, the reaction was disbelief. The ministry officials, steeped in their obsession with steel and precision machining, dismissed the findings as exaggeration. One even joked that perhaps the British were gluing their planes together because they had no bolts left. But Göring didn't laugh. His humiliation still burned, and he ordered further investigation, an entire materials team dispatched to replicate the resin. Weeks passed, and failure followed failure. German chemists tried every combination of known adhesives, formaldehyde, phenol, resorcinol, but none matched the strength or flexibility of the Mosquito's mysterious glue. Every experiment ended the same way: splintered wood, brittle joints, and wasted chemicals. Meanwhile, Hankel became obsessed. He kept a small panel of the Mosquito's fuselage on his desk, studying it by lamplight long after his colleagues had gone home. The more he examined it, the more he respected the enemy who had built it. The craftsmanship was flawless. No excess weight, no wasted material, just pure, efficient design. "It's not that we can't build it," he murmured one night, running his finger across the smooth surface. "It's that we don't think this way." Outside, Allied bombers roared overhead, some of them Mosquitoes. Their engines howled in the distance, their shadows racing across the sky. Hankel looked up through the window, realizing he was studying the very thing now terrorizing his own country. And somewhere deep inside, he felt a strange, reluctant admiration. The enemy had built a weapon out of wood, and made it stronger than steel. The longer the Germans studied the Mosquito, the more it began to feel like an insult wrapped in genius. The Luftwaffe, proud of its technological superiority, its jets, its precision engineering, its mechanized might, was now staring at proof that victory in the air could be won by something as humble as wood and glue. Dr. Karl-Heinz Henkel's lab near Hamburg had turned into a battleground of intellect and frustration. Piles of shattered samples lay beside ovens, chemical baths, and microscopes. The scientists were skilled men, chemists who had developed synthetic fuels, engineers who had designed jet engines, but none of their brilliance could replicate what the British had achieved. Each test panel split under stress, the adhesive giving way, never matching the durability of the captured Mosquito's seamless bonds. Henkel's latest experiment involved heating a sliver of the Mosquito's skin to simulate the friction and heat of flight. The resin didn't weaken. It grew tougher, the layers fusing tighter as if it thrived on pressure. He turned to his assistant with weary disbelief. "It defies our chemistry," he muttered. "They've created something that gets stronger with punishment." By December 1943, Berlin had received his full report. It concluded bluntly: "The British Mosquito's adhesive and wood lamination methods are beyond replication under current German manufacturing conditions." The words infuriated Göring. He slammed the folder shut, shouting, "Are you telling me the Reich cannot match the craftsmanship of carpenters?" But that was exactly the problem. The German war machine was built for mass production, for stamping steel, riveting armor, forging iron. The Mosquito came from a different world, a world of artisans, not assembly lines. Its builders weren't machinists but joiners, piano makers, boatwrights. Their precision came not from machinery, but from human hands and intuition honed by craft. Henkel's team even sent samples to leading adhesive manufacturers, IG Farben, Bayer, and others. But the chemical industry was too overburdened by weapons contracts to care about glue. Steel, oil, and rubber were the Reich's priorities. Synthetic resins for wooden aircraft simply didn't fit into their doctrine of total war. Meanwhile, the Mosquito's presence in the skies grew bolder. The Allies had recognized the aircraft's psychological power. It wasn't just a bomber, it was a taunt. Mosquito squadrons carried out daylight raids on Gestapo offices, precision strikes on prisons, even bombing runs that disrupted Nazi radio broadcasts mid-speech. In one infamous mission, Mosquitoes attacked Berlin precisely as Göring was giving a live radio address, forcing him to pause as explosions echoed in the background. The propaganda damage was immense. German citizens, once told that wooden planes were laughable, began to whisper that the British had mastered a new technology, one invisible to radar and unstoppable by force. In his lab, Henkel began to realize what the Mosquito truly represented. It wasn't just an aircraft. It was a symbol of how creativity could outmaneuver power. Britain had been starved of resources, forced into desperation, and from that desperation, they'd invented something elegant, efficient, and terrifyingly effective. He ran his hand along a final section of the captured fuselage before it was taken away for further analysis. The surface gleamed faintly under the lights. It wasn't armor, yet it had defied the strongest metals of the Reich. "They beat us," Henkel whispered, not with what they had, but with what they imagined. Outside, the sirens wailed again. Another air raid, another night of British engines screaming overhead. Somewhere among them, more mosquitoes raced through the dark, their wooden wings shimmering like ghosts over the Reich. And as the bombs fell, Henkel finally understood. It wasn't the glue that made them unbeatable. It was the mind that dared to build them that way. February 1944. Dawn crept over the frozen Danish countryside as 12 mosquitoes skimmed the treetops, their propellers slicing the morning mist. The mission, whispered only to a handful of men, was one of the boldest of the war. Destroy the Gestapo headquarters in Copenhagen, where hundreds of resistance members were imprisoned and where torture rooms ran day and night. The target stood in the middle of the city, surrounded by civilian streets, schools, and patrols. One mistake could turn heroism into horror. At the front of the formation, Wing Commander Peter Klebo glanced down at his map, his hands steady on the throttle. Below him, the city began to stir. Commuters, trams, the hum of occupied life. "Keep low," he called into the radio. "Stay tight. One pass in and out." His navigator gave a brief nod. Every man in the formation knew there would be no second attempt if things went wrong. The mosquitoes thundered into Copenhagen at rooftop height, their shadows flashing across windows and steeples. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, but the Germans couldn't track them. The planes were too fast, too low. The first wave struck the Gestapo headquarters with pinpoint precision. Explosions tore through the building's facade, sending glass and debris raining down onto the street. Flames erupted from the upper floors, and resistance prisoners below began shouting in disbelief and hope. Then, disaster struck. One mosquito, hit by a burst of flak, veered off course and slammed into a nearby school, killing civilians. For a moment, the formation wavered. Orders crackled. Confusion rippled through the airwaves. But Klebo steadied his men. "We finished the job," he commanded grimly. The second wave dived again, releasing bombs with surgical timing. The remaining structure of the Gestapo building collapsed in a roaring inferno. By the time German fighters scrambled, the mosquitoes were already vanishing into the clouds, heading west over the sea. The entire raid had lasted less than 20 minutes. The losses were tragic, but hundreds of resistance members escaped in the chaos that followed, their captors dead or scattered. In occupied Denmark, word of the raid spread like wildfire. To the oppressed, it was salvation. To the Germans, humiliation carved in daylight. In Berlin, the news reached Göring within hours. Another wooden squadron, just a handful of planes, had defied his entire air defense network, flying into a fortified city, destroying one of his most feared strongholds, and escaping unscathed. He slammed his fist against the table, shouting, "Every time I hear that name, it's another disgrace. The mosquito! The cursed mosquito!" For Dr. Henkel, still laboring over his unbreakable glue, the reports were both awe and torment. He read about the Copenhagen raid with a hollow feeling in his chest. All their analysis, all their science, all their pride, and yet the enemy's wooden planes ruled the skies. Each mosquito built by hands, not machines, was proving stronger than the Reich's steel wings forged by industry. Back in the de Havilland factory, workers listened to radio reports of the raid. Many wept quietly. They knew their handiwork. Those carefully carved wings and polished fuselages had not just destroyed an enemy headquarters, they had saved lives. Women sanding the panels and men sealing joints felt a new reverence for their labor. Every grain of wood carried a heartbeat of defiance. The mosquito's legend only grew. Each mission seemed to dance between triumph and tragedy, daring and devastation. But always, the outcome was the same. It came home faster than it left. By spring, even the Allied commanders admitted the truth. No other plane, no other invention, embodied the spirit of survival and ingenuity quite like it. And in Germany, the engineers could only stare at the fragments left behind, wondering how something made of wood had shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility. The report on Göring's desk was brief, factual, and utterly humiliating. Copenhagen, Gestapo headquarters destroyed by low-flying mosquitoes. Damage total, Enemy losses minimal. He read it twice, the words burning into his mind like acid. He didn't see it as a military defeat. It was a personal insult. The Reichsmarshal of the Luftwaffe, once the pride of German aviation, brought low by a handful of British carpenters. He crushed the paper in his fist and hurled it across the room. "Wood!" he roared, pacing before his stunned aides. "They mock us with wood." His voice echoed through the marble halls. "What have we built? Steel, engines, jets, and yet they humiliate us with furniture." His subordinates stood in terrified silence. They knew the truth but dared not speak it. The Mosquito was untouchable. The propaganda ministry tried to bury the news. Newspapers were forbidden to mention the attack, but the rumors were impossible to contain. German citizens whispered that the British had created a Geisterflugzeug, a ghost plane that came and went as it pleased, slipping through flak like smoke. Some swore they'd seen it gliding through the night, silent and silver, wings glowing faintly under the moon. In the testing facility near Hamburg, Dr. Karl-Heinz Hankel received another telegram. "Report to Berlin immediately. Present findings in person." He packed his samples, small panels of laminated wood, jars of resin that glimmered dark red under the light, and boarded a military train heading east. Berlin was in chaos. Allied bombings had turned vast districts to rubble, yet Göring's headquarters remained untouched, its walls hung with paintings and trophies from a war already beginning to crumble. When Hankel entered the chamber, Göring's eyes were sharp with fury and exhaustion. "Doctor," he said coldly, "you've studied this British marvel. Tell me, what magic do they use?" Hankel placed a sample on the desk. "No magic, mein Reichsmarschall. Just chemistry and craftsmanship." He explained the layers. Balsa for the core, birch for strength, spruce for flexibility. The secret, he said, lay not in the wood, but in the adhesive. A synthetic phenolic resin bonded under heat and vacuum, forming a shell stronger than aluminum and lighter than air. Göring listened, scowling. "Can we reproduce it?" Hankel hesitated. "Not quickly. The process requires fine control, special facilities, and skilled hands. Our factories are built for metal, not wood. The materials exist, but the time, the artisans. Göring slammed a fist down, rattling the glassware. "We have engineers, not woodworkers. That," Hankel replied quietly, "is precisely the difference." For a moment, silence filled the chamber. Then Göring waved him away, muttering to himself, "A wooden toy, humiliating my Luftwaffe." Hankel left the room knowing he had witnessed the moment arrogance finally met defeat. Outside, the war raged on. Night after night, mosquitoes streaked across German skies, raiding, photographing, taunting. They struck rail depots, radio stations, and command centers. Sometimes, they flew not to destroy, but to distract, drawing German fighters into the air while Allied bombers slipped through elsewhere. Even when they carried no bombs, their presence alone spread panic. In cafes and bunkers, Luftwaffe pilots spoke in low tones about the plane they could never catch. "You see it for a second," one said, "a flash of light, and then it's gone. No engine can chase it." Another added, "It's not a plane, it's a ghost with wings." Back in Hamburg, Hankel returned to his lab, disillusioned but enlightened. The Mosquito had proven something fundamental, that innovation didn't belong to the strongest, but to the boldest. And as the Reich cities burned, he began to wonder if history would remember the Mosquito not as an enemy weapon, but as a symbol of what humanity could achieve under pressure. In the distance, air raid sirens wailed again. He didn't bother seeking shelter. The sky above roared with the familiar hum of wooden wings, and deep down, he no longer hated the sound. By 1944, the Mosquito had become more than just a plane. It was a legend whispered through the smoke-filled ruins of Europe. Its missions stretched from the icy fjords of Norway to the factories of Berlin, from French rail yards to Gestapo offices. Every German commander knew its name, and every Luftwaffe pilot dreaded its silhouette. The British called it the Wooden Wonder. But to those on the receiving end, it was something worse, an omen of inevitability. For Dr. Karl-Heinz Hankel, that inevitability had turned into resignation. He stood by the window of his laboratory, watching workers dismantle what remained of a prototype meant to rival the Mosquito, a half-finished wooden interceptor that never saw flight. Shortages had crippled the effort. No glue strong enough, no craftsman skilled enough, no time left to bridge the gap. He turned back to his desk, where a British leaflet lay among his notes. It had been dropped during a recent air raid, a propaganda message depicting a sleek mosquito soaring over a burning city. The caption read, "Precision, not destruction." He studied it for a long time, realizing that the message wasn't just taunting, it was a philosophy, The Mosquito was never built to destroy blindly. It was built to strike with purpose, to prove that speed and intelligence could outwit brute force. In contrast, Germany's war machine had become obsessed with scale. Bigger guns, heavier armor, more engines. They had ignored agility, innovation, and human ingenuity. And in that blindness lay their undoing. Henkel thought back to the first day he touched the Mosquito's wooden skin in the Hamburg hangar. The warmth of it. The craftsmanship invisible beneath its lacquered surface. He had mocked it once. Now he understood it as a masterpiece of wartime paradox. Fragile yet invincible. Handmade yet ahead of its time. Outside, air raid sirens wailed again. He didn't flinch. Overhead, the distant rumble of aircraft approached. At first, it was just a low hum, but soon the unmistakable high-pitched whine cut through the air. He knew that sound now. He could distinguish it from the blunt roar of bombers or the deep growl of German engines. This one sang, a steady, confident song of twin Merlins spinning in perfect harmony. Then came the explosions. Not mass destruction, but surgical precision. Rail lines, depots, and communications towers hit cleanly, one by one. The Mosquito had come again, slipping through the night like a shadow. Henkel felt a strange admiration as the building trembled. They had perfected what he and his country could not. Harmony between man, machine, and material. As dawn broke, he walked outside among the debris. The factory's main hall was gone, flames licking at twisted metal and splintered wood. But among the wreckage, something glinted in the dirt. A small piece of plywood, singed at the edges, fused with resin. He picked it up, recognizing the same texture he'd studied years earlier. Still solid, still bonded, stronger than steel. A young soldier approached, his face blackened with soot. "Herr Doctor, we must evacuate. More bombers will come." Henkel looked at the sky, where faint contrails streaked toward the horizon. "Let them," he said softly. "There's nothing left here worth saving." He turned the fragment in his hand. "Accept a lesson." The soldier blinked, unsure what he meant. But Henkel did. The Mosquito wasn't a triumph of war. It was a triumph of thinking differently. A testament to what happened when imagination refused to bow to convention. As the last echo of engines faded, he slipped the fragment into his coat pocket. Somewhere far away, men who had once been his enemies were building futures from ideas like this. The war would end, but the innovation it sparked, the courage to defy logic, would remain. And as he walked away from the smoking ruins, Henkel whispered to himself, it was never about the glue. It was about the minds that dared to use it. The war ended not with a roar, but with silence. The skies above Germany, once filled with the thunder of engines, grew empty. The hangars where men like Dr. Karl-Heinz Henkel once dissected their enemies' secrets now stood hollow, echoing only with the ghosts of ambition. Henkel returned to his home in Bremen, his hands too steady for retirement and too haunted for rest. He no longer built weapons. Instead, he repaired radios, clocks, and furniture. Things meant to endure peace, not war. But sometimes, when the light caught the tools on his bench, he saw the shadow of the Mosquito's silhouette in their reflections. Years later, when West Germany began rebuilding its aviation industry, young engineers sought him out. They asked about the Mosquito, the glue, the wood that defied metal. Henkel smiled faintly and told them it wasn't the material that mattered. It was the thinking behind it. They didn't follow the rules, he would say. That's why they won. The world moved on. Jet engines replaced propellers, aluminum gave way to composites, and men began dreaming of reaching the stars. Yet in every workshop where innovation dared to challenge tradition, the spirit of the Mosquito lingered. It lived not in museums or history books, but in the quiet defiance of engineers who refused to accept the impossible. One spring evening, Henkel stood by his window, listening to the gentle hum of civilian aircraft passing overhead. They were light, fast, and elegant, descendants, in spirit, of the wooden wonder that once changed the course of the air war. He smiled, a weary craftsman finally at peace. "Furniture," he murmured, "the kind that helped end an empire." And in that quiet, the Mosquito's legacy hummed on, stronger than steel, lighter than fear.